I think we should start. First of all, I think I have to apologize. We mixed up the address. There are 3 UNIQA towers in the city. For every Viennese, it's evident that this house is in Taberstraße. For the Viennese government, it's in the Praterstraße. So I apologize. I hope there are persons coming still and they will find their way, but we are in a delay of 15 minutes already. So I decided to start. This is the official part now, the non-academic part. I have the pleasure, the honor, and the duty to welcome you on behalf of the executive board of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. My name is Béla Rásky. I'm the managing director of the institute. The Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies is a very young institute. And as a young institute, it of course, in a small institute, still a small institute, it of course tries to create some traditions, invent some traditions, to be that the awareness of this institute is growing. Now, one of our traditions we created is the Simon Wiesenthal lecture, which already, I think, is already kind of a trademark, a branding of the institute. We are having the 22nd lecture now in the next days. I think it's the 22nd, where Holocaust researchers from all over the world are invited to deliver a lecture on their research, which should be innovative, new. And I think it's a kind of a success, and it's a really a tradition of the institute in between. There's another tradition we are just creating. It's the fellowship program. I think it would be an exaggeration to call it a tradition because we only started in October. I welcome all our fellows who are here. I'm very happy that they are here. I think it's a great input for the institute, what they are doing, but really it's the first term, so we cannot speak of a tradition. And this venue here, the Simon Wiesenthal Conference, is kind of in between. On the one side, it's a very young creation. It's the second Simon Wiesenthal Conference. We had the last one last year called Scores of Memory, and it was about Vienna as a music city. It was about the memory on the Holocaust in contemporary music, and we had it organized together with the University of Music and Performing Arts. This one is the second conference, and the idea and the concept comes from Regina Fritz, a colleague of mine, and me. And at the beginning, we were very proud of this idea, and we thought we are pioneers. We are doing something new with this idea to kind of concentrate on early Holocaust research, early Holocaust studies. And in the course of preparing this conference, we had to find out that this is not true, that already a lot of work has been done. On the one side, we were, I think, disappointed about that. On the other side, we were quite happy because we had some works we could rely on for the call of papers for organizing this conference. The second question is the name of this conference. Maybe you are aware in organizing yourself conferences that it is very important to have a kind of a very good name for a conference. So we had the idea to call it in English, it's Before the Holocaust Had Its Name. And this is, I think, a very German-speaking idea, because the term Holocaust became popular, became widely known after the American television series had been transmitted on German-speaking television stations. In between, we found out that the term Holocaust had been used much earlier already, so this is kind of a misleading title of the conference, I think, but nevertheless we like it. I think it's a very good trademark. It is a very good name. Finally, you will find in your folder that we dedicated this conference in the memory of Karl Stuhlpfarrer. Those of you who are not from Vienna will not know him or might not know him. Karl Stuhlpfarrer, for us who have become historians in the 80s and 90s, he was a kind of a teacher. We learned from him how to use not only the historiographical tools, in a way, to learn how to use sources, how to discuss how to come up with arguments. He sent us to international conferences, watched us, how we behaved there, learned us how to act on international conferences. But he also kind of taught us to communicate with other persons. We learned from him how to talk with survivors, for instance, or anybody else. And I think this is one of the reasons that together with one of the members of the executive board of the Wiesenthal Institute, Bertrand Pertz, and me, who both of us were kind of students, pupils in his courses, decided to dedicate this conference to his memory, to the memory of Karl Schuldfrage, who is also known in Vienna as Calone. Finally, just a remark to the venue, which is, I know, quite unusual for an international conference. All I can say is when you know about the difficulties, the hardship, to get a proper conference place for 3 days shortly before Christmas in Vienna for a decent price, then you will understand that we took this generous offer of this design center to come here and to use this premises for the conference. And I also again want to apologize that we weren't quite aware of the exact address of this place here. Just some technical remarks. The team tried to prepare everything very properly, and we hope that we succeeded, and I hope everything worked fine. But whenever you have any problems asking somebody, there are young ladies and young gentlemen like me also running around here with a badge on their chest which is gray, and you can ask them anything what you want, and we will try to find out a proper answer or help you in any way. Lunch and coffee breaks are served on the ground floor. You will find the restaurant. It's easy to see when you take the elevator, the lift. Okay, this was the official part. And now I ask the first panel to come to the panel. I will be the chair, and we start officially with the conference. Thank you very much. Okay, wir haben irgendwie beschlossen, dass wir auch Sprachen wechseln jetzt am Panel. It's a German and English-speaking conference, so we will try to switch languages. I will at least try to do so. There are some lectures in English, some in German. To introduce this panel, to make you understand, we, of course, organizing the conference, you must know that organizing the panels is one of the most challenging tasks in organizing it, and of course, naming these panels. What we did is kind of find two verbs, combine them, and to explain them and put the lectures into this panel. The first one in German is called Erinnern und Handeln, Akteure der Erinnerung. Was heißt, dass wir in erster Linie die agierenden Institutionen, agierenden Einrichtungen in diesem Panel in den Vordergrund stellen werden. Es sind im Wesentlichen also drei. Das ist sozusagen diese politische Ebene, die Regierungsebene. Wir versuchen, jüdische Organisationen als Akteure in den Vordergrund zu stellen, zuletzt schließlich und endlich christliche Kirchen. Zuallererst begrüße ich Aline Sierp von der Universität Maastricht in Holland, Niederlande. Und der Titel Ihres Vortrages Silencing the Past, or Passing the Silence, German Politicians between Realpolitik and National Constraint. Ich bitte Sie anzufangen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to talk about German politicians, but not only, because I wanted to put it into a wider framework. So I'm going to also talk about other countries, mainly Italy. And basically what I wanted to do is question a little bit this assumption, a widespread assumption that you find among historians that German politicians only started to talk about the Holocaust in the 1970s. We heard that earlier on. And basically before that, especially in the 1950s, in the immediately post-war years, they said next to nothing about the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. This idea probably stems from the fact that until the 1970s, when Willy Brandt initiated the parliamentary celebration of the 8th of May, for example, there was hardly any discussions that were dedicated solely to the Nazi past, but they only emerged when other political decisions, for example, the debates on restitution were eminent. Like I said, I'm going to call into question this. I'm going to look particularly at parliamentary debates, and look then at policy constraints, so internal and external policy constraints that influence this, to then place it into this wider context. We all know that most Germans in the immediate post-war years did not think of themselves as perpetrators, but felt that they were more of a community of defeated soldiers, of prisoners of war, expellees and war widows that had first been victimized by the Nazi regime and then by the vengeful allies. This is very much present in private discussions, but you can also see it in public speeches. When you look, for example, at speeches by MPs in the German Bundestag, they usually try to separate neatly between the general population and the criminal regime, as it's called, criminal regime. Obviously then causing some kind of a, well, not really separating between perpetrators and victims. Anything that had to do with individual or collective guilt was usually vested in very abstract terms. So when you look at, for example, Paul Löbe's inauguration speech, he just talks generally about some Riesenmaß an Schuld, so just some tremendous amount of guilt without really going into details. Now I picked out several speeches to look at it in more detail, and interesting are particularly Konrad Adenauer's speech and Theodor Heus's speech in 1949, both inaugural speeches, where you can see in Adenauer's speech, for example, where he talks a lot about the future. He goes into great detail on what his government is going to do, but he never really mentions Nazi crimes. It's only mentioned in a side sentence, and then followed immediately by, his statement saying that we have to separate between the impeccable and the not so impeccable, and this separation should disappear as quickly as possible. Then he calls for general amnesty, and then dedicates several pages to the question of German expellees, of German prisoners of war, war widows, basically focusing exclusively on German victims. This you can clearly see, particularly when you look at, well, I'm going to give you a quote here, I think. Let's see if that works. No. So the quote saying basically the federal government is determined where it seems reasonable to leave things past to the past in the belief that many are subjectively not seriously guilty. Like especially this leaving things past to the past is very typical of his approach. And like I said, the other typical thing is that he's focusing very much on the future, not that much on the past, which is maybe not so surprising, but it's one of the things that are very prominent in the very first speeches in the post-year period. If you then look at Theodor Heuss, for contrast, the first German Bundespräsident, you can see that he had a very different stand. He looked to the future as well, but he also looked at the past and clearly said that the avoidance of looking at it is something negative when it comes to the restoration of Germany's national honor. And he thought that it was essential for post-war Germany in order to recover its moral political standing in Europe to look at this past. He's also the first one who connects firmly the negative memory of World War II to the Federal Republic's identity. And even if he is opposed to any tentative of amnesia, he's clearly stressing the importance, basically, of remembering. And there again, I have another quote, which is a little bit long, but I'm going to read it out to you. We may not simply forget the things which people would gladly like to forget because it is so unpleasant. We must not and we may not forget Nuremberg's laws, the burning of the synagogues, the transport of the Jews abroad to misfortune and to death. This is a set of facts which we should not and cannot forget because it makes us uncomfortable. I think these are very clear words. And as you can see from the quote here as well, he's also one of the first politicians who explicitly mentions the Jewish genocide. Genocide on the one hand, but then also the resistance, which was something quite unusual at a time when obviously people did not really talk about that yet, and when resistance was still seen as some form of treason. What is interesting as well is that he's one of the first politicians to talk about the 8th of May as a day of both liberation and political catastrophe. We all know Weizsäcker's speech, and it's usually generally assumed that he was the first one who qualified the 8th of May as, well, having two sides. However, Heuss was already doing that. And it's quite remarkable. We have to wait until the 1970s and Walter Scheel to have another Bundespräsident who finds so clear words. He certainly tried to make his office into a political center of national memory and liberal conscience. That's how he understood it, and you can see that also when you look at another speech he gave in 1952 in Bergen-Belsen, where he kept on repeating, "Diese Scham nimmt uns niemand ab," so no one will lift this shame from us. Heuss was not the only politician who was fairly clear when it comes to addressing the past. There were also other politicians who thought that the memory was, facing up to this memory was a precondition for the moral, political, and economic recovery of Germany. And one prominent example is Kurt Schumacher, who was the leader of the Democratic Party from 1946 to 1952. As for Heuss, the frank discussion of the Nazi past was, I mentioned it before, a moral and political imperative. When he's talking about the death, he always includes all death, so also those of other nationalities and of other races, which was something that was not so prominent in Adenauer's speeches, for example. He as well recognizes the Jews as victims, and as in response to Adenauer's inaugural speech in 1949, he says the following. One cannot be against Nazism without remembering its victims. Too weak has been what has been said about the Jews and the terrible tragedy experienced by the Jews during the Third Reich during the government statement yesterday. The barbarism of Hitler has dishonored the German nation through the wiping out of 6 million Jews. I don't think I have to go very much into this difference if you look at conservatives and social democrats, just by looking at these very few quotes I gave. You could probably call it, well, this different attitude, you can call it with integration versus justice. The conservatives certainly tried to avoid direct confrontation because they had learned very quickly that this would antagonize quite a number of voters. And at the same time, they were trying to integrate also a group of voters that might have constituted a reservoir for the anti-democratic right. So they tried to be as lenient as possible. This tension between memory and justice and democracy is certainly one of the dominant themes of the post-war period, and a lot of people have talked about this, have written about this. That the German population felt more comfortable with Adenauer's approach is clear when you look at the result of the elections. Adenauer, and you all know that, was rewarded by winning the 1949 elections and stayed in office until 1963. As Oleg and Levy have pointed out, indeed, at this early point, there was a radical disjuncture in many respects between the abilities of the government and of the general population to come to terms with the Nazi period. So we can basically assume that only politicians like Schumacher and Heuss, who were not driven by electoral considerations and political calculations, were able to allow themselves to support the direct confrontation with the Nazi past out of a sense of moral responsibility. It's therefore also not so surprising that Adenauer was basically absent during all the commemorative events, and most of the speeches were usually held by Theodor Heuss, Ernst Reuter, and Carlo Schmitt, who were trying to establish this link between public memory and post-war democracy. Politicians like Reuter, Heuss, and Schumacher, dealing with the past was part of a moral and civic responsibility, which was important for building a new democracy. And well, to sum up, basically, quickly, we can see that there's this big difference between the two political camps. And that basically this dealing with the past very quickly then turned also into some kind of a manifestation of ideological difference, at least that's how you could see it. What I wanted to see now is to what extent this is specific to Germany, or if you can find it also in other countries, and I chose Italy for obvious reasons, because Italy obviously had a very similar history. It would not have made so much sense to look at the Netherlands, for example, but I wanted to see what another country who was also a perpetrator country to some extent was dealing with this. Oh no, sorry, this was a bit too far. In Italy, there was a political need to demonstrate a clear break with fascism in the immediate post-war years. And at the same time, it allowed the political class to legitimize its claim for the political guidance. So this is why the 8th of September, or the time after the 8th of September 1943, when Italy changed sides, these 2 years, basically, until the end of the war, in public representation quickly turned into some kind of a war of liberation, secondo risorgimento italiano, whereas like the 20 previous years of fascism were duly forgotten, and with it, obviously, all responsibility for all crimes. Italian politicians, if you look at their speeches, concentrate basically on either Italy's pre-fascist past or the resistance experience, and in between, you don't find very much. Similar to German politicians in the immediate post-wars, they remained very hazy when they were talking about these times. They were not really directly talking about fascism and World War II, and they were certainly not talking about the Holocaust. If you look at the speech by Alcide de Gasperi, who was the first prime minister of a Christian democratic government, he's talking of aberrazione del passato, so basically aberrations of the past, before then immediately talking again about the future. So the future of Italy's frontiers, policy choices for the future, and was not at all talking about the past, basically. And in this, he resembles very much Konrad Adenauer's speech. Also, his speech made at the Peace Conference in Paris in 1946, he says, "Let us reject the reprisals of history and look towards the future." And then only shortly later, "My friends, a lot of time has passed, and I believe that all souls, especially our souls, are open towards reconciliation and inclined to forget the past." So quite clear. If you look at president's speeches, you find a very similar line there. World War II is exchangeably described as tragedy or faux pas of the past, and most of the presidents basically refrain completely of mentioning it. Generally speaking, I was looking at particular differences because, as we saw in Germany, there were these differences between right and left. I wanted to see if that was the same in Italy, and it was not. There was basically no difference between right and left. Leftist politicians remained as vague as rightist politicians, and they were all prone to use a lot of images and symbols. And I just want to show you this one quote because I actually think it's, like, from our perspective, it sounds actually quite funny when you read it. It was then discovered that fascism had not been a scourge that had descended from heaven onto the innocent crown, but a spiritual tuberculosis long ripened within the whole of society, which had become incapable, like an exhausted organism that can no longer react to the virulence of an infection, to manifest indignation and revolt itself against the brutal insanity of the few. I don't know how that sounds to you, but like when you look at this, it contrasts quite clearly with German speeches of the same time. When you take this into consideration, it was not true that there were not attempts to look at this memory in Italy. However, there was a general drive basically to not look at this. And politicians who tried that were usually very quickly it was usually very quickly assimilated into the mainstream, this anti-fascist rhetoric that developed in Italy at the time. And so at some point of time, there was basically no difference anymore, at least not in public speeches. Generally speaking, what was concentrated on was the occupation of foreign territory, and what was not concentrated on, or where no reference was made, was the occupation of foreign territory, collaboration, or the persecution of Jews, or generally speaking, all crimes committed by Italian soldiers. If this was talked about, it was always in comparison to the Italian experience, in order to exalt the heroism of the Italian resistance in a way. And often, and this is quite disturbing if you read it nowadays, this is compared to the experience the Jews had. So, to give you another quote, the torn and bloody survivors were pushed against the walls at the bottom of the stony valleys along the dusty slopes and mowed down with machine guns, a tragedy that equals only the incredible massacres in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And they're talking about Italian soldiers here who were committing crimes, war crimes in Greece at the same time. You can clearly see how this is being, well, the idea of victims and perpetrators is not clear-cut. As I said before, the difference with German political discourses are striking if we leave aside particular Adenauer's approach, which was dictated by electoral consideration. Generally speaking, I think we can say that German politicians were more willing to face up to this past, believing that the frank discussion was a moral and political imperative and a precondition for moral, political, and economic recovery. Italy, on the contrary, regardless of the political belonging, and I should go there, espoused a very selective absolutist version of history, which allowed itself to reintegrate quickly into the Western European concert, and that's basically where this external element comes in. This was certainly very important. The other one was an internal constraint, which was to reconcile the different forces within the country, which then led basically to the elimination of any question of responsibility. And that is also the reason why this whole question of the need to remember or to forget did not really play a role in Italy. It certainly did not play a role when it came to the division of the political forces. And I think this division in Germany was really quite important to then get to something which then was later termed Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The avoidance strategy, however, had a clear political purpose in both states. However, I think that this idea of a silence is certainly misleading, especially if you look at the German case. There was quite a number of internal constraints, and I've named them before. Like this is Italy and Germany, I divided them into the two. However, when you look at, well, the external constraints, they were much more prominent in Italy, I think, than they were in Germany at the time. And I was surprised to find that, because I was so sure that I would find a lot of external constraints that were pushing Germany into a certain direction. And I was surprised to see that that only started to play a role in the 1960s, really. That's when basically the outer framework references to other countries became prominent. So we can basically say that they were not absent, external constraints, I mean, but they played a less role than I had anticipated. What was much more important was its internal debate that was taking place on the political level. However, I'd like to be contested on that. So if you have maybe there's something that slipped my attention, and I'm open to debate.
Okay, thank you. We decided, even if you're open to debate, that we're first going to have all the lectures, and then together we are going to discuss it. I think especially the Austrian historians will bring in their research into your paper, I think, and I think the Hungarian fraction too will also, as a perpetrator country, be able to put in their research and their point of view on this question. Our next speaker is Simon Perego, who came from France. He is from the, which I never know because it's Centre d'Histoire de Sciences Po, Sciences Politique from Paris. Currently is a fellow at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah also in Paris. And the title of his presentation is Commemorating the Destruction of European Jewry During the First Post-War Decade in French Jewish Initiatives and Non-Jewish Actors.
First of all, I would like to, of course, sincerely thank the organizers of this conference for giving me this opportunity to present a part of my current doctoral research. It has long been assumed that French society and politicians did not pay close attention to the particularity of Jewish suffering during World War II until the 70s, when a public debate emerged about the Vichy regime responsibilities. And it has also long been said that even Jews themselves participated in this conspiracy of silence, as they were eager to reintegrate into French society and not to dwell on the dark period of persecution. In fact, there was undoubtedly an understanding of the war that was specific to the Jewish community instead of the collective repression often described. French Jews made intensive efforts to remember the anti-Semitic persecutions in many ways, for instance, through commemorations, here defined as collective ceremonies involving different categories of social actors and offering a narrative of the past through rituals, speeches, and specific places. Indeed, while official national ceremonies during the decade immediately following the war did not include the murder of the Jews in their narrative, the Parisian Jewish world began commemorating the Jewish experience of the war right after France's liberation. And during the subsequent decade, the Jewish community, added to the commemorative calendar, chose its place of memory and invented new rituals to publicly remember the tragic fate of their people. Some of these annual commemorations were dedicated in a general way to the Jewish victims of the war, and other commemorations were dedicated to specific historical events. For instance, the voluntary engagement of foreign Jews in the French army in 1939-1940, the first substantial arrest of Jewish men in Paris in May 1941, the first execution of Jewish hostages in France in December of the same year, the massive so-called Veldiv roundup in July 1942, and, of course, the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto in April-May 1943. However, French Jewish memory of the Second World War was not hermetic, and Jewish community leaders interacted continually with non-Jewish actors, including political ones. Precise analysis of Jewish commemorative practices now makes it possible to explore these interactions between Jews and non-Jews in the production of commemorative practices, to understand the roles played by each of them in this process, and to analyze the symbolic and political benefits they expected. More specifically, relying on the analysis of Jewish sources, my presentations aims to take Jewish commemoration as a starting point to study the efforts made by non-Jewish actors in order to remember the event soon to be named the Holocaust by responding to Jewish commemorative initiatives. To study in detail the Jewish-Gentile interactions, I have decided to focus on three of the previously mentioned ceremonies: the commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the commemoration of the first massive arrest of foreign Jews and of their transfer to French internment camps, and the commemoration of the Veldiv roundup, during which, for the first time, women and children were arrested. In addition to their importance on the Jewish commemorative calendar, there are two reasons for choosing these three ceremonies. First, they allow to study the commemoration of events that occurred in Poland as well as in France, and it is, of course, particularly interesting to study how the place where persecution occurred affected the position of non-Jewish actors. And second, these ceremonies provide us with the opportunity to analyze different commemorative contexts. Indeed, the commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto and the commemoration of the Veldiv roundup were held in Paris, as the last commemoration of the creation of internment camp was held in Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande, two small cities in the French province, so as a pilgrimage. My presentation is in three parts. First, I will present in general terms the multifaceted presence of non-Jewish actors during Jewish commemorations. Second, I will analyze the reasons why Jews invited non-Jews to their memorial service, and also, of course, why non-Jews accepted their invitations. And third, I will consider the impact of the non-Jewish presence at Jewish ceremonies in order to evaluate how the attendance and participation of non-Jews transformed the way these Jewish commemorations took place. And thus, by examining these questions, I will consider these public ceremonies through the lens of the interactions between Jews and non-Jews, which is, of course, only one of the many aspects of these fascinating rituals. It is first important to note that non-Jews who took part in post-war Jewish commemoration were of various religious and political affiliations and played different roles during the ceremonies in question. Gentiles were not involved in every single Jewish commemoration that was held in France during the first decade following the war. Nevertheless, between 1945 and 1955, non-Jews were present at around 65% of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemorations, at around 75% of the Veldiv Roundup commemorations, and at every single commemoration of the internment camps opening. However, these figures are not without complicating factors. First, it is necessary to underscore the evolving dimension of non-Jewish participation to Jewish ceremonies. There were, for instance, at the beginning of the period, several non-Jewish speakers and sometimes a substantial financial participation to the organization. But such involvement began to diminish when global commemorative activity decreased in the wake of the first years after the liberation. Second, the geographical context had also an influence. The participation of non-Jews was much more significant in Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande than in Paris, partly because the annual Jewish pilgrimage in these two small cities was a local event in itself, unlike the numerous Jewish ceremonies held in the French capital. Third, the level of non-Jewish participation also depended on the identity of the Jewish organizers. For instance, Jewish communists were more willing than Zionists to invite Gentiles. And fourth, there were different levels of non-Jewish involvement. Indeed, non-Jewish actors could take part in Jewish commemoration in various ways, such as simply and anonymously attending the ceremony, appearing in the patronage committee, accepting the honorary chairmanship of the memorial service, officially attending the ceremony without giving a speech, sending a message read in absentia by another speaker, giving a speech, or taking part in the artistic program of the commemoration. Such diversity can also be found in the various categories of non-Jewish official participants. They could be representatives of local or national authorities, of Catholicism and Protestantism, of foreign countries, of national political parties, or of non-Jewish war victims and non-Jewish members of the French resistance. They also could be independent, well-known figures or individuals honored for having helped Jews during the war. To address the question of the non-Jewish portion of the audience during Jewish commemorations, it is necessary to distinguish between the ceremonies held in Paris and the ones organized in the two previously mentioned provincial towns, Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande. As for the Parisian commemorations, even if the Yiddish press sometimes insisted on the common participation of Jews and non-Jews, the audience was nevertheless mostly Jewish. And by contrast, during the commemorations in Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande, the audience was partly made up of non-Jewish local inhabitants, and we can only conjecture why they were present. Some hypotheses are the fact that commemorations were announced in the local press, their personal memories of the occupation and of the suffering of the Jewish prisoners, or maybe more simply, as I have already said, they were curious to see an unusual event happening in a small provincial city. Now that I have described the different aspects of the non-Jewish participation to Jewish commemorations, it is necessary to explain what was at stake for Jews in inviting non-Jews and why so many non-Jews accepted this invitation. The recognition and the very participation of non-Jewish actors at these commemorations was for their Jewish organizers a form of recognition of their people's suffering and heroism, as well as means to inform non-Jews through their representatives about their tragedy. As for the recognition of Jewish suffering, every speech by a non-Jew systematically expressed sympathy towards World War II Jewish victims. Certain non-Jewish actors even evoked the French responsibilities in the Jews' persecutions and deportations by denouncing the collaboration and the Vichy regime, however, often in association with a celebration of the French people's attitude towards the Jews in distress. Furthermore, the recognition of Jewish heroism was a fitting line of discourse in the French post-war period, which was deeply marked by the celebration of resistance. Non-Jewish speakers at Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemorations strongly emphasized Jewish armed heroism, describing the famous insurrection as an example for French and European resistance against Nazism. The participation of non-Jewish actors was also very important to French and foreign Jews, as it symbolized their reintegration into French society after having been persecuted and treated as outcasts. And in this respect, while the attendance of official public representatives was, of course, decisive, we should not neglect the participation of other non-Jewish actors. Indeed, the presence of Catholic and Protestant envoys symbolically reinstated Judaism as a member of the spiritual families in France, while the presence of political actors marked the return of Jews in the French political life. This presence of political actors had another function. It also was a way for Jewish organizations to clearly affirm their own political affiliation. Indeed, well-known French socialists were systematically invited to Bundist commemorations, while French communist leaders spoke at almost every Jewish communist ceremony. Nevertheless, it was also strategic for a Jewish organization not to limit its invitations to political actors who shared its political views in order to prove that its commemoration went beyond politics. In that case, the presence of non-Jewish actors can also be understood as a way to legitimize memorial services and to present them as non-partisan events in a competitive Jewish commemorative environment. For their part, non-Jews were present at Jewish commemorations for several reasons. First of all, it would be unfair to understand their presence only on a political and strategic level without mentioning moral and humanist issues. These non-Jewish actors were aware of the tragic fate that the Jews had suffered, and they had sometimes proved this awareness at their own risk by helping them during the German occupation. However, they often understood the Jewish tragedy, as Jews sometimes also did, through a universal rhetoric based on patriotism, anti-racism, or anti-fascism, allowing them to connect to their own political culture the Jewish experience. Non-Jews also had their own agenda. For a representative of the state, giving a speech at a Jewish commemoration was an opportunity to affirm the government's position and defend its action on specific issues directly concerning the Jewish population in France. Representatives of political parties did not forget politics either. On the contrary, they made use of the intense politicization of the Parisian Jews and of their divided Zionist, communist, or Bundist ceremonies as a means of affirming their own political position. Though they sometimes recalled how their organizations had supported the Jews during the war, they also addressed current subjects on which the Jewish organizers and the mostly Jewish audience were eager to hear non-Jews take a stand, such as anti-Semitism, property restitutions, the punishment of wartime persecutors, the creation of and support for the State of Israel. The very nature of Jewish commemorations, which in their form had much in common with political meetings, surely incited non-Jewish political actors to also directly address internal French politics. One of the speakers addressed, I don't know how, the question of criticize the industrial policy of the government during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for instance. But they also addressed Cold War issues, naturally. Soviet anti-Semitism, which was denounced by socialists during Bundist ceremonies, West Germany's rearmament, the Rosenberg affair, and the Korean War, repeatedly tackled by communist representatives who were invited to Jewish communist commemoration. It is now important to evaluate the concrete impact of the presence of and participation by non-Jewish actors on Jewish ceremonies, through examining the issue of the language that was used, the content of speeches given by Jews, and the ritual followed. While Jewish commemoration concerned every Jewish subgroup in Paris, the Yiddish-speaking one was the most involved in the administration of the ceremonies in question. Nevertheless, even if this group was particularly attached to the commemorative use of its language, the presence of non-Jewish guests made it complicated to conduct a ceremony in a vernacular that they absolutely did not understand. Consequently, in ceremonies involving several non-Jews, Yiddish was mostly used during the artistic portion of the commemoration. The presence and participation of non-Jews during Jewish commemorations also had an impact on what was said by Jewish actors, especially regarding the attitude of the French people towards the persecuted Jews. Indeed, Jewish speakers particularly celebrate the French resistance, which freed them from Nazism, and very often insisted on the help that Jewish population received during the war from non-Jewish French people, but not without denouncing the collaboration, thus converging on certain non-Jewish speeches I mentioned previously. This expression of gratitude was common at the time, for instance, in the Jewish press, but the non-Jewish presence clearly provided an additional incentive for Jews to publicly celebrate non-Jewish solidarity as well as the French resistance. While commemorations of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Veldiv Roundup were entirely organized by Jewish actors in Paris, the annual memorial service held in Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande was a co-production between the main association of former Jewish deportees from France and the local authorities. Therefore, it allows us the opportunity to precisely study how the ritual could also be affected by non-Jewish participation. The collaboration was firstly a question of timing. Indeed, it was important to match the Jewish commemorative calendar with that of local festivities, as the annual Jewish pilgrimage was not to encroach on the local Christian or secular celebrations. The choice of location for these ceremonies was also a product of the partnership between Jews and non-Jews. And in this respect, the case of Pithiviers is particularly interesting. As we can see on this slide, the commemoration procession, composed of Jewish survivors and numerous representatives of local authorities and associations, gathered at the town hall, which was a symbol of republicanism in the French urban topography. The first portion of the procession was at the town memorial, dedicated to inhabitants killed in action during the First and Second World Wars, and in front of this monument, the Jewish delegation used to lay flowers in memory of the French dead. A similar ceremony was held in front of the deportation memorial dedicated to non-Jewish locals who died in concentration camps, and it was only then that the procession went to the site of the former Jewish internment camp where a commemorative plaque had been inaugurated in 1946. There, local authorities used to lay flowers in memory of the Jewish victims. Thus, through this co-produced ritual, Jews and non-Jews exchanged symbolic recognition of their respective losses. I would like to conclude by saying that though non-Jewish actors very rarely took the initiative in organizing commemorations of the Jewish experience of the war, they nonetheless played an important role in the production of Jewish commemorative practices. Their presence was fundamental for the Jewish community leaders who invited them, as it emphasized the reintegration of Jews into French society and acknowledged their suffering. For their part, by attending year after year Jewish memorial services, non-Jewish actors surely familiarized themselves with the specificity of the Jewish faith during the Second World War, even if they often integrated it into a broader universal narrative, and even if further research must be undertaken in order to know to which extent they evoked it within their non-Jewish environment. It is therefore necessary to re-evaluate the role played by non-Jewish actors in France in the shaping of Holocaust memory, or at least of Holocaust Jewish memory, in a period where they allegedly avoided acknowledging the specificity of the Jewish wartime experience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Und jetzt kommt der Sprachwechsel. Ich freue mich jetzt ganz besonders, Hans-Jörg Buss begrüßen zu dürfen von der Universität des Saarlandes in Saarbrücken. Hans-Jörg Buss ist Historiker, war lange Zeit Archivar und hat zahlreiche Veröffentlichungen im Bereich der kirchlichen Zeitgeschichte. Der Titel seines Beitrages, der kirchliche Beitrag zur Auseinandersetzung mit der Shoah und der Schuldfrage am Beispiel der evangelischen Landeskirche der Hansestadt Lübeck 1945 bis 50. Und ich bitte ihn zu beginnen.
Ja, guten Tag. Auch von mir vielen Dank für die Einladung und für die ausgezeichnete Betreuung. Ich habe mich entschlossen, diesen Beitrag in Deutsch zu halten. Das ist einfacher für mich und besser für Sie. Ich hoffe, dass die meisten folgen können. Unser ganzes Erleben ist ohnegleichen. Wir können zurückgreifen bis ins Altertum. Es hat wohl Vernichtung kleinerer Völkergruppen gegeben, aber nie die eines 80-Millionen-Volkes. In der frühen Auseinandersetzung mit Nationalsozialismus und Shoah waren die beiden christlichen Großkirchen ein meinungsbildender Akteur ersten Ranges. Wiederholt wandten sie sich mit Erklärungen, Stellungnahmen und Hirtenbriefen an die christliche Öffentlichkeit. Auch weniger gut dokumentiert, in Predigten wurde die Auseinandersetzung mit der jüngsten Vergangenheit immer wieder gesucht. Die Kirchen erkannten den nationalsozialistischen Zivilisationsbruch als eine tiefgreifende Zäsur, der nicht ohne Folgen bleiben konnte. Bedeutende Worte der evangelischen Kirche waren die Stuttgarter Schulderklärung des Rates der EKD vom Oktober 1945, das Darmstädter Wort des Reichsbruderrates zum politischen Wege unseres Volkes, sein Wort zur Judenfrage und schließlich die richtungsweisende Weißenseer Erklärung der EKD-Synode vom April 1950. Zugleich aber, so die Hauptthese dieses Vortrages, begrenzte und verweigerte die Kirchenmehrheit und hier genauer die kirchenleitenden Gremien vor dem Hintergrund einer spezifisch kirchlichen Deutung des Nationalsozialismus eine kritisch-rationale Auseinandersetzung mit den Realitäten des NS-Staates und der Shoah. Diese Beschränkung hängt mit dem Fortwirken einer nationalprotestantischen Mehrheitsmentalität, der anhaltenden Orientierung an tradierten Denk- und Bewältigungsstrukturen zusammen, aber selbstverständlich auch mit den gravierenden politisch-sozialen Umwälzungen. Kriegsniederlage, die Aufteilung Deutschlands, der Verlust der protestantischen Ostgebiete, die gemeinhin als Katastrophe empfunden wurden. Die kirchliche Reflexion von Nationalsozialismus und Völkermord stand stets in einem Spannungsverhältnis zur nationalen Selbstbehauptung und einer Sichtweise, in der die Deutschen Opfer der nationalsozialistischen Vergewaltigung und der aktuellen politischen Verhältnisse waren. Das Eingangszitat weist in diese Richtung. Es ist einer Predigt von Johannes Pautke entnommen, vom 6. Mai 1945, der ersten bekannten kirchlichen Äußerung nach dem Einmarsch der britischen Armee in Lübeck. Wirkungskraft und die Grenzen des kirchlichen Handelns sollen im Folgenden am Beispiel der kleinen, selbstständigen evangelisch-lutherischen Landeskirche der Hansestadt Lübeck gezeigt werden. Einer knappen Einführung folgen 4 Punkte. Aspekte der kirchlichen Selbstreinigung, die kirchliche Deutung des Nationalsozialismus, die Diskussion der Schuldfrage und die Auseinandersetzung mit der Shoah und dem andauernden Antisemitismus, die beide immer im Kontext des Verhältnisses zum Judentum gedacht wurden. Im Gegensatz zu Parteien, Gewerkschaften und anderen Gruppierungen waren die kirchlichen Organisationsstrukturen 1945 im Kern intakt. Sie waren zonenübergreifend organisiert und verfügten über einen einigermaßen funktionierenden Verwaltungsapparat. Die 4 Alliierten begegneten den Kirchen mit einem großen Vertrauensvorschuss und statteten sie mit zahlreichen Privilegien aus. Für den Aufbau eines demokratischen Deutschlands wurde ihnen eine bedeutende Rolle zugewiesen. Insgesamt galten die Kirchen als weitgehend unbelastet und wurden, grob vereinfacht, zur Opposition gegen den NS-Staat gezählt bzw. sogar im Widerstand verortet. Für die Zusammenbruchsgesellschaft des Jahres 1945-46 kann ihre Bedeutung kaum überschätzt werden. In einer Situation der Krise, materiell wie psychisch, erwiesen sich Seelsorge, das Spenden von Trost und kirchliche Sinndeutungsangebote für Millionen von Menschen als Stabilitätsanker. Von der konkreten Lebenshilfe über die diakonischen Einrichtungen ganz zu schweigen. Die Kirchen waren voll. Im Dezember 1946 besuchten etwa 46.000 Gläubige die evangelischen Gottesdienste. Das heißt, allein hier wurden zwischen 15 bis 20% der evangelischen Bevölkerungsmehrheit erreicht. Für das Folgende ist dieser Wirkungsgrad immer mitzudenken. Ein Wirkungsgrad, den wohl keine andere Großorganisation aufweisen konnte. Innerkirchlich waren die Folgen des Kirchenkampfs bestimmend, der vor Ort mit sehr großer Härte geführt worden war. Die Abrechnung mit dem Nazi-Kirchenregiment unter Bischof Erwin Balzer, eines der radikalsten im Deutschen Reich, führte innerhalb weniger Wochen zu einem vollständigen Führungswechsel. Sämtliche Leitungsämter wurden mit Personen der Lübecker kennenden Kirche besetzt, die damit auch die uneingeschränkte Deutungshoheit über die jüngste Vergangenheit erlangte. Angesichts der bemerkenswerten Unkenntlichkeit dieses alten Kirchenregiments vollzog sich der Neuaufbau unter der Prämisse, dass die Landeskirche in ihren Grundlagen zerstört sei. Sämtliche Aufbaugesetze bis hin zur neuen Kirchenverfassung des Jahres 1948 waren kirchliche Reaktionen auf die deutsch-christliche Häresie und die politische Vereinnahmung durch den NS-Staat. Die ihr innewohnende Begrenzung auf kirchlich-theologische Aspekte soll ja am Beispiel der kirchlichen Selbstreinigung aufgezeigt werden. Kennzeichen des Balzer Regiments war ein Antisemitismus in seiner radikalsten Ausprägung. Die Bekämpfung alles Jüdischen war ab Mitte der 30er Jahre ein zentrales Moment landeskirchlichen Wirkens. Die Landeskirche führte den Aria-Paragraphen für Pfarrer, Beamte und Angestellte ein. Vor allem aber gehörte Lübeck zu den wenigen Landeskirchen, die auch die zweite Phase antisemitischer Kirchengesetzgebung umsetzte, die sich gegen die nicht-arischen Gemeindeglieder richtete. Ende 1941 erreichte diese Politik mit dem Gesetz über den Ausschluss rassejüdischer Christen ihren Höhepunkt. Keine 3 Wochen nach der Deportation von 90 Lübeckerinnen und Lübeckern trennte sich die Landeskirche einseitig von ihren nicht-arischen Glaubensschwestern und Brüdern. Die Vorarbeiten sind auf das kirchliche Forschungsinstitut zur Erforschung und Beseitigung des jüdischen Einflusses auf das deutsche kirchliche Leben in Eisenach zurückzuführen, das von der Landeskirche von Beginn an getragen worden war, personell wie finanziell. In den landeskirchlichen Selbstreinigungsverfahren gegen die deutsch-christlichen Pastoren wurde der landeskirchliche Radikalantisemitismus an zentraler Stelle reflektiert. die Haltung zu diesen zu den kirchlichen Judengesetzen und die Lübecker Mitarbeit an dem Eisenacher Entjudungsinstitut wurden akribisch abgefragt und in die kirchlichen Spruchkammerentscheidungen einbezogen. Hier schlug die Lübecker Kirche einen Sonderweg ein. Bis zum 1. Mai 1947 wurde ein Viertel der alten landeskirchlichen Pastoren dauerhaft ihres Amtes enthoben. Die rassistisch motivierte Ausgrenzung der Christen jüdischer Herkunft verstand man jedoch nicht als einen kirchlichen Beitrag zur Ausgrenzung, Entrechtung und Verfolgung der Juden, sondern als eine Verletzung des christlichen Bekenntnisses. Das heißt, als ein Beitrag zur Zerstörung der Kirche. Diese Denkfigur findet sich auch in der öffentlichen Auseinandersetzung immer wieder. Als wirkungsmächtigster bürgerlicher Erklärungsansatz für die NS-Zeit gilt das Säkularisierungsparadigma. Der Nationalsozialismus war demnach eine Folge einer Entwicklung, die bereits mit der Französischen Revolution eingesetzt habe, der Abfall des Menschen von Gott. Der bereits genannte Johannes Pautke, mittlerweile Propst und Vorsitzender der Lübecker Kirchenleitung, predigte im Oktober 1945: Das radikal Böse ist eine ansteckende Krankheit, eine furchtbare Seuche. Ich erinnere nur an das Frankreich von 1791, an das Russland von 1881 und 1917 und an die Tage, die Millionen jetzt erleben. Wir müssen uns wehren gegen das Reich des Satans, das immer wieder hereinbrechen will, bis aufs Blut. In diesem Tenor gab es wortgewaltige Verurteilungen des Nationalsozialismus, der zugleich aber dämonisiert und entmenschlicht wurde und ohne konkrete Gestalt blieb. Der Nationalsozialismus war der Satan, der Verführer, der antichristliche Dämon. Konkrete Zuschreibungen, die öffentliche Benennung von Tätern wurden hingegen vermieden, im Gegensatz zu den sehr plastischen Beschreibungen der deutschen Not oder der Situation der deutschen Kriegsgefangenen. Hier ist von Interesse, dass dieser Ansatz die Diskussion der Ursachen und der Genese des NS-Staates behinderte. Fragen zum Aufkommen der nationalsozialistischen Bewegung, zur Demontage des Verfassungs- und Rechtsstaates, zum Abbau demokratischer Grundrechte, selbst zum Mordprogramm an Menschen mit Behinderungen und zum Völkermord an den europäischen Juden. Also allesamt Punkte, die zwangsläufig das kirchliche Selbstverständnis tangiert und selbstkritische Fragen nach dem eigenen Verhalten aufgeworfen hätten, wurden kaum thematisiert. Diese sehr eindimensionale Deutung dominierte die Landeskirche. Andere kirchliche Deutungsangebote, die es selbstverständlich auch gab, wurden nicht aufgegriffen. So hatte Karl Barth, um nur ein Beispiel zu nennen, einer nüchternen und kritischen Ursachenanalyse des Nationalsozialismus das Wort geredet, ohne den Ballast erbaulicher und theologischer Erläuterung. Denn dann, so der berühmte Schweizer Theologe, würden sich die Dämonen in Rauch und Gestank auflösen. Alleinhauptpastor Wilhelm Janasch, 1934 in den Ruhestand versetzt und einziger Lübecker Pastor, der sich dem dalemitischen, dem radikalen Flügel der bekennenden Kirche angeschlossen hatte, sprach in einem Brief die kirchliche Mitschuld am Aufkommen jenes Revanchistengeistes, der sich im Hitlerreich so furchtbar geoffenbart habe, an, ohne Resonanz. In seiner Replik verteidigte Propst Pautke das kirchliche Handeln während der Weimarer Republik und auch sein eigenes. Die Hoffnung auf Gleichberechtigung, der Appell an Recht, Vernunft, Einsicht und Billigkeit sei durch den Satanismus der vergangenen 12 Jahre zu Fall gebracht worden. Er äußerte sich erst Jahre später konkret zur kirchlichen wie zu seiner persönlichen Mitverantwortung. Janasch, der in Berlin aktiv an der Rettung von Jüdinnen und Juden beteiligt war, erfährt in Lübeck bis heute nicht die Anerkennung in Lübeck, die ihm meiner Meinung nach zugesteht. Für die Kirchen eröffnete die Einordnung des Nationalsozialismus in die Säkularisierungsgeschichte zugleich die Möglichkeit, den belasteten Begriff der Nation aus ihrem historischen Kontext zu lösen und neu zu besetzen. Er ermöglichte eine Unterscheidung zwischen den Nationalsozialisten und den Deutschen. Diese Unterscheidung kam schnell apologetischer Charakter zu. Dieser Befund ist hier nicht unwichtig, da hiervon vor allem die eigene Klientel betroffen war, das heißt jene Funktions- und Verwaltungselite, die sich trotz ihrer eindeutig politischen Nähe zum NS-Staat kirchlich gehalten hatte. Der Historiker Axel Schild nannte diese Deutungsfolie einen wesentlichen Beitrag zur Restituierung des konservativen Milieus. Die Säkularisierungsthese legt zudem nahe, dass die Bewältigung des nationalsozialistischen Erbes allein in der Renovatio Christianii, der Wiederherstellung des christlichen Staates, liegen könne. Auch die viel diskutierte Schuldfrage wurde im genannten Tenor geführt. Der Nationalsozialismus war eben nicht das Ergebnis eines konkreten deutschen Sonderweges, sondern eine Sünde, an der auch andere Völker kranken. In den Gemeinden wurde diese Sichtweise weitgehend geteilt. Die wenig konkrete, in ihrer Wirkung aber bedeutende Stuttgarter Schulderklärung des Rates der EKD vom Oktober 1945 mit der berühmten Selbstanklage, dass, ich zitiere, wir nicht mutiger bekannt, nicht treuer gebetet, nicht fröhlicher geglaubt und nicht brennender geliebt haben, löste dort großes Befremden aus und wurde der Kirche zum Vorwurf gemacht. Die Reaktionen auf das Stuttgarter Wort zeigen nochmal exemplarisch die innerkirchliche Ambivalenz. Offiziell stellte man sich hinter das Schuldbekenntnis und hielt fest, dass so viel Unglück über so viele Menschen durch Deutsche gekommen sei. Andererseits aber betonte man stets, dass das Wort vor Gott gesprochen sei und der Eindruck einer politisch gefärbten Demonstration vermieden werden müsse. Dabei war man sich der vorherrschenden Meinung in den Gemeinden durchaus bewusst, denen der vollständige Text auch nicht bekannt gegeben wurde. Eine leidenschaftliche Leserbriefdebatte in den Lübecker Nachrichten vom Herbst 1946, die sich an einem kritischen Kommentar über Martin Niemöller, dem wortgewaltigen Vorsitzenden des Reichsbruderrates und EKD-Ratsmitglied, entzündete, machte dies mehr als deutlich. Zitat: Das damalige Bekenntnis der Kirche zur Kollektivschuld hat viele bewogen, uns von der Kirche zu trennen. Herr Pastor Niemöllers Kritik ist uns keine Hilfe. So dachte die evangelische Mehrheit. Die Ablehnung der Kollektivschuld, von der in Stuttgart übrigens nie die Rede war, überhaupt der Thematisierung der jüngsten Vergangenheit, wurde selbst innerhalb der Pfarrerschaft geteilt. Bereits Ende November 1945 warf der Lübecker Gustav Völsch seiner Kirche die ständigen Schuldbekenntnisse vor und hinterfragte, inwieweit während des Nationalsozialismus denn wirklich alles abwegig oder falsch gewesen wäre. In der Nazizeit hatte sich Völsch eindeutig gegen das NS-Kirchenregiment auf der Seite der bekennenden Kirche positioniert und er gehörte zu jenen Pfarrern, die kurzfristig entlassen worden waren. 1947 amtierte er kurzfristig als Synodenpräsident. Einerseits also setzte sich die Kirche wiederholt mit der Schuldfrage auseinander und trug diese auch in die Gemeinden. Andererseits aber begrenzte man sie so, dass sie einer ehrlich rationalen Debatte abträglich war. In diesem Sinne beteiligte man sich, im historischen Vergleich zu 1918 ist das nicht unerheblich, auch an Gedenkveranstaltungen, wie zum Beispiel an einer von der Vereinigung des Verfolgten des Naziregimes initiierten Gedenkwoche für die Toten des deutschen Widerstands. Man zeigte Präsenz, was durchaus wahrgenommen wurde. Andererseits aber verstand man die Teilnahme an der Gedenkfeier auf dem Lübecker Hauptfriedhof explizit als Teil der Evangeliumsverkündung. Mit dem Bekanntwerden der deutschen Verbrechen war das Entsetzen groß. Ich zitiere: Sind nicht durch deutsche Menschen, Söhne deutscher Mütter, getaufte, christlich erzogene Menschen Dinge getan worden, die wir nie für möglich gehalten hätten, von denen Totschlag, ein bloßer Totschlag, verblasst als ein geringes und nicht nur gezwungen, zähneknirschend unter stärksten inneren Widerstand, sondern kaltblütig, zynisch, grausam, unmenschlich? Eine kritische Auseinandersetzung mit Judenfeindschaft und Antisemitismus, der Shoah und eigenen antijüdischen Ressentiments spielte in der Lübecker Nachkriegskirche dennoch kaum eine Rolle. Das angeführte Predigtzitat vom Juni 1945 änderte nichts an diesem Grundtenor. Es gibt keine Hinweise, dass die medizinischen Experimente in Bergen-Belsen, die Massenmorde in Auschwitz oder die Deportation der Lübecker Jüdinnen und Juden, Ereignisse, über die die lokale britische Lizenzpresse ausführlich berichtete, in kirchlichen Gremien reflektiert wurden. Ergebnis war eine Nichtwahrnehmung der jüdischen Verfolgungsgeschichte jenseits einer allgemeinen moralischen Betroffenheit. Es zeigt sich dieselbe Befangenheit in rein theologischen Denkkategorien, die bereits in der kirchlichen Selbstreinigung eine entscheidende Rolle gespielt hatte. Eine landeskirchliche Erklärung an die Gemeinden gab es, wie in den meisten Landeskirchen, nicht. Ebenso wenig Reaktionen auf den aufsehenerregenden Vorschlag der Kirchenleitung aus Bremen zum 7. Jahrestag der Pogromnacht, die zur freiwilligen Sühneleistung und zur Hilfe beim Wiederaufbau von Synagogen und jüdischen Friedhöfen aufrief. Diese Haltung deckt sich im Umgang mit der kleinen jüdischen Gemeinde, die in Lübeck rasch wieder begründet wurde und die für den norddeutschen Raum eine wichtige Rolle spielte. Diese wurde schlichtweg nicht wahrgenommen. Auf eine Anfrage zu den Lebensbedingungen jüdischer Flüchtlinge schrieb Propst Pautke am 8. November 1946: Meine Umfrage bei den Amtsbrüdern hat ergeben, dass sie dieselben Erfahrungen gemacht haben wie ich. Allen, die uns bekannt geworden, geht es gut. Es überrascht demnach auch nicht, dass zu dem sich alsbald wieder aufkommenden Antisemitismus kein kirchliches Wort gefunden wurde. Zu der im März, April 1947 einsetzende Welle von Übergriffen, deren Höhepunkt in der Nacht von Gründonnerstag auf Karfreitag die Schändung des jüdischen Friedhofes war, schwieg die Kirche. Ebenso zu anderen Ereignissen, wie zum Beispiel zu den antisemitischen Presseaufgriffen im Zusammenhang mit dem Lübecker Aufenthalt der sogenannten Exodus-Flüchtlinge. Erst langsam und unter dem Eindruck der ersten Schritte zur Neubestimmung des jüdisch-christlichen Verhältnisses setzte ein Umdenken ein. Im April 1948 nahm die Kirche offiziell an der Einweihung des Gedenksteines auf dem jüdischen Friedhof in Meusling teil, mit dem an die Ermordung der europäischen Juden erinnert wurde. Noch bedeutsamer war die Teilnahme von Bischof Pautke an einer Veranstaltung mit Leo Beck, Rabbiner und Überlebender von Theresienstadt und zu diesem Zeitpunkt eine der bekanntesten Persönlichkeiten der Juden. Ein Wendepunkt markierte schließlich das bedeutende Berliner EKD-Wort zur Judenfrage. So heißt das ist der offizielle Titel. Vom April 1950, das die klare Anerkennung der kirchlichen Mitschuld an den Verbrechen gegen die Juden und die Absage an jede Form von Antisemitismus beinhaltete. Die Christen wurden zum Gespräch mit den Juden ermutigt, als Ausdruck konkreter Verantwortung für den Frevel, der durch Menschen unseres Volkes an den Juden begangen worden ist. Zudem wurden sie aufgerufen, sich dem Schutz der jüdischen Friedhöfe anzunehmen. Diese Erklärung wurde auch in Lübeck intensiv rezipiert. Von einer öffentlichen Kundgebung der Erklärung und einer breiten Thematisierung in den Gemeinden, die noch im Mai ins Auge gefasst worden war, wurde allerdings nach einer als Dienstveranstaltung angesetzten Studientag für alle Pastoren Abstand genommen. Belegt ist letztlich eine Veranstaltung mit dem Titel Die Judenfrage im Lichte der Heiligen Schrift. Hier zeigt sich die Rückverschiebung des politischen Impetus zugunsten einer theologischen Fragestellung, die nach der Intervention einiger Pastoren auch den Studientag bestimmt hatte. Dort war der Völkermord allerdings nicht vollständig ausgeklammert worden. Dennoch bot die Berliner Erklärung den Anlass zu kirchlichen Worten zur Shoah, auch im Hinblick auf den, ich zitiere aus dem Protokoll des geistlichen Ministeriums, in den Gemeinden zweifelsohne vorhandenen Antisemitismus. Preses Jensen nannte die Erklärung einen Akt der Buße und bekannte sich ausdrücklich zur kirchlichen Mitschuld durch Schweigen und Unterlassen. Zitat: Jeder hat gewusst von der Kristallnacht im Herbst 1938, als in allen Städten Deutschlands die Synagogen brannten und jüdische Geschäfte und Wohnungen zertrümmert wurden. Aber wie alle, ob hoch oder niedrig, dazu geschwiegen haben, so hat auch die Kirche damals kein Wort dazu gefunden, von wenigen Ausnahmen abgesehen, die dafür schwer büßen mussten. Von dem, was dann später geschah in den Jahren des Krieges, besonders in Osteuropa, hat wohl keiner alles gewusst, aber viele haben etwas gewusst. Jedoch keine Stimme erhob sich dagegen. 5 Jahre nach Kriegsende waren diese Worte in bisher nicht bekannter Deutlichkeit. Kurz darauf bezog auch Bischof Pautke Stellung, als er von dem Wiederaufkommen von Antisemitismus in rohen und erschreckenden, teils in etwas zivilisierteren Formen warnte. Christen beziehungsweise Menschen, die Christen sein wollen und auch glauben, es zu sein, befinden sich auf einem gefährlichen und verderblichen Irrweg. Ich zitiere: Habt ihr wirklich schon die entsetzliche Ernte vergessen, die aus dem ungeheuerlichen Morden, das vor allen anderen an Juden geschehen ist, aufgegangen ist? Können denn wirklich Christenmenschen einen so wahnsinnigen Irrtum verfallen, dass sie zwar Gottes Kinder wären und seines barmherzigen und gnädigen Schutzes sich erfreuten und der Vergebung der Sünden, aber die Juden wären es nicht? Irret euch nicht ein zweites Mal. Gott wird sich ein zweites Mal noch weniger spotten lassen. Ich komme zum Schluss. Die Bedeutung der Kirchen in der Auseinandersetzung mit Nationalsozialismus und Shoah ist von großer Ambivalenz geprägt. In der unmittelbaren Nachkriegszeit war die Auseinandersetzung mit dem Nationalsozialismus, der Schuldfrage und auch dem Völkermord zwar unterschwellig stets präsent und wurde kirchenöffentlich wiederholt thematisiert, andererseits aber trug man mit der Dämonisierung des NS-Staates zur Vernebelung von dessen Genese und politisch-sozialen Gehaltes bei. Schuldbekenntnis und Schuldabwehr, die Benennung des nationalsozialistischen Zivilisationsbruch und dessen gleichzeitige Entkontextualisierung, eine scharfe kirchliche Selbstreinigung und die Ablehnung der alliierten Entnazifizierung, eines der großen kirchlichen Themen, die Verurteilung des Völkermordes und das kirchliche Eintreten für ehemalige Nationalsozialisten und Kriegsverbrecher konnten vor diesem Hintergrund Hand in Hand gehen. In der Gesamtbilanz überwogen wohl retardierende, antiaufklärerische Momente und eine Stärkung der Schweigegemeinschaft. Ende 1946 und im folgenden Jahr 1947, angesichts der anhaltenden schlechten Versorgungslage und einer zunehmend pessimistischen Grundhaltung, brach sich daran anknüpfend eine Aufrechnungsmentalität den Weg, die angereichert mit revanchistischen Untertönen zur nationalen Gegenanklage mutierten. Politisch entsprach diese Mehrheitshaltung dem protestantischen Kernmilieu. Die extrem rechte Deutsche Partei, die stark im protestantisch-konservativen Bürgertum verankert war, erzielte bei den Lübecker Bürgerschaftswahlen 1948 einen Stimmenanteil von 12%. Die Gründung der Lübecker CDU 1945 ging ohne nennenswerte Beteiligung evangelischer Kräfte vonstatten, nachdem in den Fusionsverhandlungen eine Zusammenarbeit mit den früheren protestantischen Deutschnationalen wegen deren extremer Rechtseinstellung abgelehnt worden war. Ein Zurück gab es freilich nicht. Mittel- und langfristig war in der Auseinandersetzung mit Nationalsozialismus und Shoah auch die Saat für die kirchliche Annäherung an Demokratie gelegt, die sich freilich erst in einem mühsamen und von vielen Konflikten begleiteten Häutungsprozess vollzog. Ein ähnliches Fazit ist für die kirchliche Neubestimmung ihres Verhältnisses zum Judentum zu konstatieren. Das ist nicht mehr Thema dieses Vortrages. Ich danke Ihnen für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Ja, ich danke jetzt auch den drei Vortragenden. Wir haben schon eine Wortmeldung. Ganz kurz möchte ich das zusammenfassen und dann gehen wir in die Diskussion. Ich hatte jetzt ein bisschen das Gefühl, dass das Panel ein Problem hat am Ende, dass es sehr stark auf West- und Nordwesteuropa konzentriert war. Also wir hatten hier verschiedene Fragestellungen aufgeworfen, von deren Diktion ich eigentlich von überall kenne. Also die Wörter sind überall gefallen: Opfer, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, Schuldfrage. Und ich kenne die aus der österreichischen Historiografie immer in einem anderen Kontext. Das ist ein bisschen immer anders. Mir ist auch aufgefallen, also eben bei Aline Sierps Vortrag, und ich glaube, das wäre sehr wichtig gewesen, ob jetzt diese Kontrollgruppe Italien wirklich jene Gruppe ist, die hier eine bessere Aufklärung kann gegenüber Deutschland, oder ob es nicht andere Täterstaaten sind. Also ich denke jetzt hier an Österreich zum Teil, sicherlich auch an Ungarn, also dass das, wo auch der Holocaust ja auch passiert ist, während in Italien in dieser Form so eine ganz andere Konnotation hat. Das ist nur die Idee, dass das hier so jetzt wirklich gefehlt hat. In Simon Perego's, I wasn't quite sure about something, maybe I was misunderstanding it. In East Central Europe, Jewish and communists are antagonists. So it's in a way, if you memorize the Holocaust as a communist party, you had lost any identity, or you do not have anything to do with Jewishness. And I think that somehow in France, this is possible, having a Jewish communist commemoration, which seems for me as a Central European something like a contradictio in adjecto, which is interesting, and I just would ask you to kind of clarify on that. Beim letzten Vortrag ist es auch bei mir ein bisschen so, Hans-Jörg Buss, es ist wieder genau diese Frage, glaube ich, die ich jetzt schon öfters aufgebracht habe und das mir so ein Anliegen ist, als Wiener Institut an dieser Schnittstelle zwischen West- und Osteuropa oder Mitteleuropa zu sein. Die Konnotation mit dem Lutheranismus in Österreich ist eine Kollaborationskirche. Also das ist jene Kirche, die also nicht einmal den Versuch unternommen hat, das, was Sie beschreiben das sehr schön. Ich finde, das hat mir also dieses Steckenbleiben in theologischen Fragestellungen nicht weitergehen. Aber die Frage für mich wäre, es gibt immerhin das. In der österreichischen Kirche habe sogar ich das, also in der lutheranischen Kirche zumindest, also lange Zeit vermisst. Ich glaube, die erste wirkliche Erklärung in Bezug auf den Holocaust ist in den 80er Jahren, ich glaube, rund um die Ermordung von 3 Roma in Oberwart. Ich glaube, dass die Pastorin Burgenland, also damals eine Erklärung gab, das ist die erste große Erklärung der lutheranischen Kirche in Österreich. Entschuldigung, ich wollte das jetzt nur kurz zusammenfassen, aber es hat schon hinten eine Wortmeldung gegeben. Karl Pfeiffer.
Zum ersten Vortrag hätte ich vorgeschlagen, doch nicht mit Italien, da bin ich Ráskys Meinung. Da wäre besser gewesen, mit der DDR zu vergleichen. Es gibt ein wunderbares Buch von Jewry, Zweierlei Erinnerung, und das hätte ich bevorzugt. Aber I'm going now to talk about the second presentation, and I have the question, and I feel that this would have been much more important to tell us not so much how many non-Jews and Jews participated, but about the falsification of French history after the Second World War, the falsification of the Communist Party. We know that the first communist resistance were not Frenchmen, they were foreigners. That was the group Manouchian, and most of them were Jews. And the French Communist Party falsified this. This is one thing. And I believe the fact that France needed, I do not know how many years, I believe 30 or 35 years, to bring the first film about this, La Pitié, this film. I believe that was during the 60s. It came only about the fact that the majority of French society was very glad when Marshal Pétain took the power, and it was really behind Marshal Pétain until very, very long during the Second World War. Und jetzt zum dritten, dem möchte ich absolut gratulieren zu seinem brillanten Vortrag. Danke.
Vielen Dank. Doch eine Wortmeldung hinten. Wenn Sie sich bitte ganz kurz vorstellen, immer, weil wir wissen noch nicht unseren Namen.
Okay. Katrin Stoll, DHI Warschau. The first paper started from on the assumption that there's a widespread belief in scholarly discourse that only from the 1960s onwards German politicians started to talk about the past in the parliament. But could you maybe specify who exactly claims this? Because, I mean, if you look at the studies dealing with the so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung in Western Germany, they usually start with Norbert Frey and others. I mean, they mentioned that they're aware also of the Ben-Gurion, Adenauer negotiations about the Wiedergutmachung, and then there's also the speech by Konrad Adenauer in which she's also invasive and says that crimes committed in the name of Germans, not by Germans, but the topic is mentioned in scholarly discourse. So could you maybe specify who exactly makes this claim?
Okay, another one here.
Are we still collecting? Yeah. Natalia Election to Royal College. I have a question for Simon. I found it fascinating, and it actually fills in, I think, an important gap. There is research done on that kind of communal efforts in the United States. So I wonder if you could say a little more about the Jewish actors who are involved. Is there some kind of consistoire politics of doing it? Is this individuals? How it plays out, Paris versus province, in some greater detail? Thank you.
My name's Lars Fischer. I teach at Cambridge and London. I've got sort of short questions for each of you. One of them's almost been taken up already, which is obviously the Norbert Frey question. There's, I think, an essay by Alan Steinweiss who makes the interesting argument that he thinks that probably Adenauer was the chancellor who spoke out most radically, albeit for strange motives, about the issue of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and the German chancellors have become more cowardly ever since, which would again be an inversion of that argument. On the French topic, I'd be quite interested to hear a little bit more about what actually goes on at these events. I'm sort of slightly reminded of Clifford Geertz and the idea that people are sort of doing things that all look the same if you look at them from the outside, but when you look at them from the inside, they take on quite different meanings. So what actually happens at these events and what's actually articulated? Because if we're going to understand the significance for commemoration of the Shoah specifically, having a better idea of that, I think, will be quite important. Und dann als letztes für Herrn Buss. Ich verstehe natürlich genau, was Sie damit meinen, wenn Sie sagen, das wird ins Theologische abgeschoben. Aber andererseits ist das Problem doch gerade, dass es sowohl politisch als auch theologisch nicht richtig behandelt wird. Und eigentlich hätte man doch gern beides, oder?
Imke Hansen, Universität Hamburg. I have a question to Simon Perego. In Poland, especially in Warsaw, we see very much how the non-Jewish commemorators occupy Jewish festivities and take them over. To which extent is there something similar in France? And also, to which extent include those commemorations Jewish rituals, like Jewish religious elements? Und eine Frage an Hans-Jörg Buss. Ganz am Anfang haben Sie gesagt, haben Sie von diesem Vertrauensvorschuss gegenüber der Alliierten, gegenüber der Kirchen gesprochen. Wodurch war der begründet? Woher kam der? Ich meine, angesichts der deutschen Christen kann man sich doch da wirklich nur wundern.
Okay, I think then we go to the, you start, who wants to start? Anybody?
Well, I was the first one.
Okay.
I can start. Yeah, well, the control group, Italy as a control group, that's obviously debatable, and maybe it would have been better to talk about Austria or, another perpetrator nation. I chose Italy for the simple fact, well, I think if we only look at the Holocaust, it probably would have been better to choose another country. I chose Italy because it had a very similar political history, if you so want, and is therefore comparable to Germany. It's basically the successive, following from, it's a following state, if you so want. So you have a very similar political situation there. That was the reason why I wanted to compare the two. When it comes to who claimed that the German politicians didn't say very much about it. I mean, the most prominent is certainly Lübbe, who was talking about communicative silence, but also Greifenhagen or Mitscherlich, for example, claimed that. And you rightly mentioned that certain topics were only addressed in the context of certain debates, so the debate on restitution, but there was hardly any debates that were only addressing the Nazi past. So what I was saying was that certainly Adenauer did mention it, but only very much in context of another, well, in a different context, if you so want. Whereas, like, as I showed, I think Heuss and Schumacher clearly addressed this and were questioning, particularly this tendency in society to not talk about these things.
Thank you for so many questions. So first, about the Jewish communist identity, I can understand how strange it sounds, but that's true that in France there was a very strong Jewish communist group. Of course, its identity was based on its political affiliation, but in their mind there was a possibility to be communist and stay Jewish. And their cultural identity, of course, was not based on religion, but on their attachment to a common culture, and especially on the Yiddish language, which was the main common factor. So for them, there was no problem to deal with both identities, even if, of course, some communist Jews decided to stop appearing as Jew in the public sphere. But in the East European Jewish world, there was no contradiction. Sir, so sorry if I didn't speak about what you was expected. I will try my best next time, but I'm kidding. Yes, of course, the public discourse of the Communist Party clearly decided to avoid the Jewish dimension of the communist resistance. But my point here was to show that there were some spaces, some moments where communist leaders were able to adapt their discourse. And of course, Jewish commemoration was not the right place to forget about the Jewish identity of resistance fighters. So I totally agree. The Manoukian group was composed by many Jews, except for their leader, which was Armenian. But you know, when you study, for example, the inauguration of commemorative plaques for communist fighters who were Jewish, at this very specific occasion, the communist leaders in front of a Jewish audience had no problem to emphasize the Jewish identity of the fighters. So there are simply different levels of discourse and of circumstances. But definitely the most important part, the most visible aspect of this public discourse was a denial of the Jewish identity of fighters. As for the confrontation with the Vichy heritage, Le Chagrin et la Pitié, the movie of Ophuls, was released in in the 70s, 76, I guess. And once again, as we are discussing the question of silence, in these commemorations, there was no problem denouncing the collaboration. For instance, for communist leaders, it was obvious and very easy to denounce the regime they had fought against. So, once again, it depends on the context, and I guess...
You say they fought after 41, after June 22nd.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, they went to the Germans and...
No, of course, but...
legalized.
Yeah, but there is a historical fact and then the memorial apprehension. So I won't discuss with you about the fact that the Jewish policy, the communist policy was ambiguous at the beginning of the war in France. There is no question about that. But after the war, they presented themselves as the opposite of Vichy. So denouncing Vichy after the war was very easy, for instance, in communist circles, which has quite a big audience. So this question about the silence around Vichy, if you open L'Humanité, which was a daily read by many, many people, Vichy was all around. So once again, it depends on the milieu, and it's really hard to speak about, in general, about a society of 50 million of people. About the many Jewish actors, thank you, especially because I was questioning myself about integrating in this paper the consistoire, which is the representative body of the French Jews integrated who define their identity solely on their religious affiliation. And of course, in the case of the consistoire, which were very integrated, the presence of non-Jewish actors was important in their ceremonies. Their ceremonies were, of course, very different because they were not so political. They were held in synagogues. There were mourning rituals, and they didn't want to be anything else. As for more broader presentation of Jewish actors, there were several, especially because the Jewish Parisian community was particularly fragmented, depending on political affiliation, ethnic affiliation. There was, of course, a large number of East European Jews, but Sephardic Jews, French Jews, and this is a microcosm of many, many organizations. So maybe we could talk about that in details later. As for your question, yes, in France, Jews kept the control of their own commemorations. So there is no thief of, the narrative, or no forced ritual, or they invited non-Jewish actors because it was important to their eyes, but there was really no obligation. They did not feel any, obligation to do so. And sorry, mister, my very French-English skills oblige me to ask you to repeat your question. Yes, I did not quite understand, so could you just repeat very simply for...
I'd just be interested to know what actually happens at these events. I mean, how is the Shoah actually commemorated? Because that's surely significant for an evaluation.
Yeah, so most of these commemorations were composed of many, many discourses. It was very important for them to talk, and I don't know if today we could stand such long commemoration, 6, 7, 8 speakers speaking 30 minutes. Some of them had religious rituals, and by the way, even communist ones, because the objective was to gather the most important audience. So you couldn't be too picky with your own Jewish identity. So Jewish communists had no problem having a rabbi saying the Kaddish or El Molech HaChamim at the beginning of the ceremony. And something which is very interesting is the artistic program, which always closed a ceremony with performances. So the past was also explained through songs, through plays, poems, and it was actually an important aspect of the most broad Jewish cultural life in Paris after the war, because all Yiddish actors and singers were present at these ceremonies. And that's what is, I think, so interesting about these commemorations, because they don't only give us information about memory and narratives. It's also a way to understand how this Jewish Parisian world function in politics, in religion, in cultural life. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Zu Ihrer Bemerkung, Herr Fischer, Sie haben recht. Es stimmt. Der Neuaufbau der evangelischen Landeskirchen vollzog sich in der Regel mit Personen, die im Kaiserreich sozialisiert worden waren hier und die Adolf Stöcker anhingen, inklusive hier seinen antisemitischen Vorstellungen, die die Weimarer Republik abgelehnt haben und die einfach in dieser nationalprotestantischen Mentalität verhaftet waren und der auch einfach nicht rauskamen, sondern die wirklich in einem ganz mühsamen Prozess gelernt haben, sich der Realität anzupassen und eben auch unter diesem Spannungsfeld lagen hier. Sie wussten, was der Nationalsozialismus war und was er ist, da konnte man nicht hin. Und auf der anderen Seite hing man aber Idealen nach, die einfach vergangen war. Und da waren viele dran gefangen. Also dieser Bischof Pautke, den ich mehrfach zitiert habe, der trat nach dem Krieg in eine Partei ein, die für die Wiederherstellung des Kaiserreiches eintrat. Das waren die Möglichkeiten, die er hatte. Und mit der Realität musste er lernen, umzugehen. Also sie waren gar nicht in der Lage, weiterzudenken. Und das kam meiner Meinung nach erst wirklich auch im Generationswechsel. Warum haben die Alliierten den Kirchen Vertrauensvorschuss geleistet? Also erstens, die evangelischen Kirchen standen halt unter dem Eindruck von dem Kirchenkampf, also hier die lange Jahre hier als Auseinandersetzung zwischen Gut und Böse, zwischen der bekennenden Kirche und den deutschen Christen bewertet wurde. Und die deutschen Christen konnte man relativ einfach ablehnen. Und dadurch hat die bekennende Kirche gewonnen. Und sie konnten sich eben so darstellen, als ob sie Widerstand geleistet haben. Das war furchtbar selbstgerecht, apologetisch und hat auch nicht gestimmt, aber das war das Bild, das nach außen vermittelt wurde. Und die Alliierten, also alle 4 Alliierten, konnten das schlichtweg nicht beurteilen, konnten, glaube ich, viele Sachen einfach gar nicht beurteilen. Und es gab auch viele einfach Falscheinschätzungen. Also die britischen Behörden haben 1946 so eine Konferenz gemacht und nachdrücklich dafür geworben, die Kirchen sollten sich am Wiederaufbau der Demokratie beteiligen und dafür seien sie prädestiniert. Das war aber ein vollkommen angelsächsisches Kirchenverständnis. Das hat insbesondere die Lutheraner haben das überhaupt nicht verstanden hier. Also sie haben gesagt, hier Kirche ist Kirche, das haben wir im Nationalsozialismus gelernt und die Staatsform spielt für uns keine Rolle. Die Kirche konnte sich als Widerstandsbewegung darstellen. Ganz interessant ist, sie hatten natürlich auch die finanziellen Mittel, das historisch abzusichern, eben mit der Kommission für Kirchenkampfforschung. Dort wurden Bilder produziert, die eigentlich erst in den 70ern und eigentlich erst in den 90ern vollkommen aufgebrochen worden sind. Sie waren einfach gut drin, sich selbst darzustellen und da waren sicherlich viele Selbstzuschreibungen da, die schlichtweg die einfach nicht belastbar sind. Vielleicht ein Beispiel. In Bayern wurde die bekennende Kirche generell als Widerstandsbewegung festgeschrieben, 1946. Der Landesbischof, ich glaube ab 1934, der dann auch nach dem Krieg weiter amtiert hat, Hans Meiser, der unter anderem dafür verantwortlich war, dass das da reingeschrieben worden ist. Nachdem waren viele Straßen benannt und die ersten Umbenennungsaktionen, also in München gab es hier mit breiter Diskussion auf Stadtratbeschluss gab es, glaube ich, 2008 oder 2009, das weiß ich nicht genau. Also das hat sich sehr, sehr lange gehalten, dieses Bild von der bekennenden Kirche, die Widerstand geleistet hatte, obwohl es eben einfach nicht belastbar war. Ja.
Vielen Dank. Wir haben ein bisschen noch Zeit bis zur Mittagspause. Ich habe schon eine Wortmeldung für eine zweite Runde. Also ich eröffne eine zweite Runde, bitte aber sich jetzt sehr, sehr knapp zu fassen. Regina Fritz möchte kurz.
Danke. Ich hätte eine Frage an Aline Sierp. Und zwar fand ich das sehr interessant, dass es in Italien der Diskurs also zwischen den politischen Parteien so einheitlich ist und dass da eben keine Divergenzen da sind. Ich bearbeite eben Ungarn und da ist es eben ganz anders. Bis zum Jahr 1946 gibt es da sehr unterschiedliche Positionen und es gibt eben auch sehr wohl Forderung nach kritischer Auseinandersetzung mit der Vergangenheit. Und daher eben auch die Frage, woher kommt denn das in Italien, dass hier der Diskurs so einheitlich ist? Gibt es da eine Begründung dafür? Und welche Rolle spielt hier auch vielleicht die Friedensverhandlungen, die eben in Ungarn schon sehr wohl auch den Diskurs mit beeinflusst haben?
I would like to ask Mr. Perego about the date. When did these events happen and how long did they last? Over years? And what is, and if you make a comparison to other towns in the province, did there happen anything else?
There's another one. Jonathan Woods.
Jonathan Wiesen, Southern Illinois University. A question for Aline Sierp. Can you, I suspect I know the answer, but was there communication between Heuss and Adenauer about strategies such as how to represent the past? In a sense, I imagine it's more spontaneous, but I do wonder if there was some sense that there should be coordinated efforts. And if so, is it simply conservative versus FDP versus socialist? How do we account for some of these differences? And then I'll leave it at that. I have many more questions, but I'll leave it.
Okay, then I close. No more possibility. Okay, then I ask. Answer the questions.
Me? Okay. I'm going to do that in English, sorry. Is that okay? I find it difficult to talk about my work in German, even though I am German originally. Well, why wasn't there any difference? I have to stress that this is in the immediate post-war years. At some point of time, the discourse divides itself. However, in the immediate post-war period, the peace treaty, or like the everything that was happening immediately afterwards, did play quite a big role. So I don't think the situation is much different from Hungary, only that the outcome is different. Italy was very eager to show that they had broken clear from fascism and that they had done that with their own hands. So that's why they concentrate so much on the time after the 8th of September 43, when they changed sides, right? And that's why they concentrate so much on the resistance. And to a certain extent, the Allies fostered that as well. There was nothing like the Nuremberg trials, nothing comparable to that, for example. War crimes were not prosecuted immediately, and in Italian society very quickly this idea of, well, we were actually the victims and we had never been on the side of Mussolini developed very quickly, and they were very successful in just getting this picture across also abroad. I mean, if we think about Italy now, very often people do not realize how much they were involved in certain war crimes and how much they were involved also in the Holocaust in the end, just by making sure that Jews were rounded up in these intermediate camps to then be transported to the concentration camps in Germany. So basically the main aim was to detract attention from this, concentrate on everything that happened after 43, and then claim this legacy of the resistance. And all political forces were doing that for obvious reasons of trying to reintegrate into the Western nations on the one hand, to make sure that the peace treaty negotiated was not punitive for Italy, and then to integrate also within the country the forces following one narrative. If there was communication between Adenauer and Heuss, to be honest, I don't know. I didn't find any evidence for that. But it would be interesting to know, maybe just by looking at things that were not voiced publicly, but were taking place in the corridors.
Yes, about the calendar, of course, it's an important question when for someone studying commemorations. For the commemoration of historical events, of course, they chose a date near the anniversary day, but which was more complicated was to choose a day to commemorate in a general way the victims whose date of death was unknown. So they chose the highly religious period of the Yamim Noraim between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to commemorate the dead whose date of death was unknown. And there was a trick because they wanted to have people to attend their ceremony, so they chose the Sunday before Rosh Hashanah, during which morning prayers are recited, slichot, to have their commemoration because, as you know, the Jewish calendar is not always the same every year, but this specific day was always on Sunday. So for this practical reason, and of course the religious justification of a mourning day, the rabbinic authorities in France chose this specific day. Okay, right after the war, in 1944, until today. Every single commemoration I mentioned are still organized, but there is a new one which is now dominating, is of course Yom HaShoah, due to the Israeli influence on Holocaust remembrance in France and everywhere. So, but still, every commemoration is still organized. As for a comparison with other cities, I mostly work on the Parisian case, but of course every community had its own local history of persecution. So in Bordeaux, there was a big roundup in January 1944, and of course this was the main event in the local remembrance ritual.
Okay, thank you for your patience for the first panel. Thank you especially for the lectures. This is a technical announcement now. Lunch is being served in 5 minutes on the ground floor. I just want to remind you, as you already realized, we're in a shopping center. Shopping centers attract thieves, so we decided to close the room during lunch, so your valuables you have deposited here are protected, or at least are locked off. I ask you, and we want to open again because the team, everybody wants to have lunch. We are going to reopen this hall quarter before the afternoon panel starts, which is at 14 o'clock, which means that 13:45 this hall will be open again. And now you're all invited for lunch on the ground floor. Thank you very much.